Hi, everybody. I'm Jenna. I'd like to take this opportunity to give you all a warm welcome from the Perry Center. And today is the final session in our series, Recovering the Sacred. There are a couple of Zoom rules. During the presentation, we ask participants to turn off their microphone to ensure better quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if we can hear background noise. The chat is open and we do encourage you to use it as it's a great way to share your thoughts on the presentation with other participants. The sessions will be recorded. Today, I have the honor of introducing you to Jeremy Lent, who will be speaking about weaving a web of meaning, how recognizing our deep interrelatedness lays a path to sustainable flourishing. Jeremy Lent is an author and speaker whose work investigates the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis and explores pathways toward a life-affirming future. His award-winning books, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, and The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. He's written extensively about the vision and pathways toward an ecological civilization and is the founder of the Deep Transformation Network. Thank you for being with us today, Jeremy. I'll hand the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna, for that introduction. And yeah, it's really an honor and a special moment to be able to present these ideas to you all today. So thanks for that. And what I'm going to do is, for the first part of this session, I'm going to take you through a slideshow, which actually has a couple of little videos incorporated in it, which are kind of fun and alive. Then we're going to move to breakout rooms for a short time to share some ideas and thoughts for each of you to have on what arose from the presentation. And then we'll be allowing some, plenty of time at the end for just sharing whatever arose in those breakout rooms with a bigger group, or asking me questions or your own reflections on what I'm going to be sharing with you. So I will begin by actually sharing the screen right now. And looks like everything is going to be working there. So of course, let me know if you're not seeing anything, as you should, but I think it's all working. So I'm going to be talking today about weaving a web of meaning, in particular, how recognizing our deep interrelatedness lays a path to sustainable flourishing. And I'd like to begin this presentation with a little bit of, you might say, like a big picture, basically a picture of our Earth, the only place we know of right now in the universe where we know that life exists, and quite possibly, most likely elsewhere in the universe it's there, but we don't know about it. And we know on this beautiful planet, in the midst of all that darkness, life arose quite early on in the planet's life, billions of years ago. And it evolved incredible richness and diversity, but it's only been the last couple of 100,000 years at most that a particular species arose with a particular kind of intelligence that enabled it to actually have an impact on the very global system that we see right there in this beautiful planet. And so as we are aware of that, of course, that species is our own species, Homo sapiens, we need to ask ourselves, well, what have we been doing with this incredible power that collectively our species has evolved? And the answer, as of course, I'm sure every one of you are only too familiar with, is we've been doing a pretty awful job. And everywhere we see around us in the world right now, we see these harbingers of a really daunting and even terrifying future of, wildfires, floods, and droughts, like breaking out basically every part of the world. And of course, we know that what is going on is a function of climate breakdown or climate emergency. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this kind of slide, looking at our emissions just rising and rising and rising. And at the moment, as we're only too familiar with after the another kind of fiasco of COP27, we're really headed by the end of the century towards what scientists are calling like a catastrophic rise in temperature since a pre-industrial age of maybe more than 3 degrees Celsius. And even if we were to see some of the more aggressive actions or more hopeful actions being implemented by countries, we'd still be heading to more like a 2% rise, which scientists call a prescription for disaster. And all that, of course, comes from these, we're entering the zone of these cascading, amplifying feedback effects of the climate. So that in itself is terrifying. But here's the thing. Even if we were to somehow find a way, some sort of magic bullet to bring those emissions way down and keep the temperature rise within a more manageable, like say 1.5 degrees or whatever, we've got to recognize that even the climate disaster itself is just a symptom of even deeper underlying problems. And those problems arise from the vast ecological destruction that we are causing around the world. And just to give you a pointer of the kinds of things I'm talking about, well, it was recently reported that since 1970, just 1970 alone, the last 50 years or so, there's been a 69% decline in animal populations worldwide. As a result of that, and other aspects of what's going on, we're entering now what scientists are referring to as the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth. The first 5 were caused by exogenous events, things like massive volcanic eruptions or meteor hits. This one is caused by one particular species, our own. We're virtually certain to be looking at the annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And by the UN's own reports say that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by the middle of this century. But of all these statistics, the one that kind of blows my mind the most is this one, that by 2050, at current rates, there will be more plastic in the ocean by weight than fish. It's kind of hard to get our heads around. And when we look at what has been going on in all this, scientists have studied like what has been happening in terms of the human impact. And they've recognized what they call the Great Acceleration, which basically, as you can see from this chart, is a sort of a great acceleration since roughly the end of the Second World War. And it's a great acceleration basically in virtually every aspect of production and consumption, basically the human impact on the Earth. And almost every chart you look at relating to human activities has this kind of massive sort of exponential rise. And what is terrifying even more about this is that if this looks historically, right now, mainstream economists are projecting that even with all this rate of destruction happening right now, we're looking at a tripling of that level of global production of all that stuff, and basically between now and the middle of this century. So it's because of this that climate scientists and earth scientists are warning us that we're rapidly heading for a precipice. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Johan Rockström and the Stockholm Resilient Institute, where they tried to define what they called the safe operating space for humanity some years ago. And they identified a whole series of like 9 planetary boundaries in different dimensions of what would be that safe operating space. And then we've now measured that in most of those 5 or 6 of those different dimensions, we have blown out of those planetary boundaries. That green represents the safe operating space. The orange represents the amount by which we've blown through those boundaries. And as a result of that, scientists are saying things like this. They're warning humanity, saying like, soon it'll be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. One professor from the Potsdam Institute says there's a very big risk we continue down the present path that we will end our civilization. And UN Secretary General just the other day is telling nations of the world, this current path that we're on is collective suicide. So how did we get to this place is a reasonable question that we all should be asking. And in one of my earlier books that Jenna mentioned, called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, I looked at the different ways in which humans have made meaning out of the world from earliest hunter-gatherer times to the present day, as a sort of look underlying way of trying to trace our path to how we got to today. And one of the things that I distill, the recognitions I distill from that book, was this simple statement that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And by the same token, our values, the dominant values we have in our society today, are what will shape the future. So it's reasonable then to ask, well, what are these values that are dominant in our society? And fundamentally, our values are based on separation. I think this picture I see as kind of iconic for our society right now. Here is everyone lining up for their food, separate from each other, connected with their technology. So separate, they're separate from even the food they're eating. Probably none of them are giving a moment's thought to the actual source of that food. And they're just like picking it up, eating it while they're connecting again back to their iPhones or whatever. And if we go to a layer deeper than just this recognition of separation, we can see that there's like a story of separation attached to that. And that modern story of separation goes something like this. It tells us that nature is a machine. It tells us that humans are separate from nature, that humans are separate from each other, that human progress itself arises from basically the conquest of nature. And the earth itself is a resource to exploit for human benefit. And ultimately, as a result of all that, the purpose of life is basically just to get wealthy and powerful, to basically maximize that exploitation. But in a book that I wrote more recently, the last couple of years, that Jenna mentioned, called The Web of Meaning, integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe. What I showed, and what I'm going to be taking you through in the rest of this presentation, is that every one of those elements of that modern story of separation are actually false. And what that means is they're not just dangerous and leading us to destruction, but from a scientific perspective, they aren't even, there's no scientific validation for that. And in that book, and in our presentation from here on, we're going to be looking at how the findings of modern sciences, such as neuroscience, complexity science, evolutionary biology, or system science, integrates with the deep understandings of traditional wisdom sources, such as indigenous knowledge, Taoism, or Buddhism. And all of these different findings from traditional sources or modern science point to a recognition of our intrinsic interconnectedness. And we're going to explore this today by focusing just briefly on some of the most foundational existential questions that pretty much every human being asks in some form or other at some point in their life. Questions like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? And ultimately, why am I? And so let's begin with the first of these questions. Who am I? And if you basically just sort of stop somebody at random in a city, pretty much anywhere in the world, and ask them that kind of question, the answer they'll give you will probably be based to some degree or other, even if they're not even aware of it, on this foundational statement by René Descartes, one of the sort of founders of modern Western philosophy, hundreds of years ago. Probably the most famous statement in philosophy today. I think, therefore I am. Of course, in Latin, cogito ergo sum. And if you think about what that statement actually means, if you sort of unwrap it a little bit, what it basically is saying, I think, therefore I am, is that human identity itself exists solely through our conceptualizing, like our thinking capacity. And as a result of that, the implication is that animals who don't think the way we do, and even our bodies where our thinking capacity is housed, essentially don't have real identity. They're kind of like mere machines. But what scientists have now discovered in the last few decades, ethologists who study animals, is that animals are most definitely not machines. We now know that elephants, for example, can communicate with each other over hundreds of miles through infrasound. We know that they perform ceremonies over dead family members. We now understand that dolphins and whales actually talk to each other. They've even been identified to do so in local dialects. They're thought to call each other out by name and even to gossip about those who are temporarily absent. Wolves, we now understand, show deep family commitment, and the males in wolf packs help raise the young along with the females until they reach maturity. But it's easy enough to see some of this wisdom and intelligence in sort of high-functioning mammals, somewhat similar to us in some ways. But what we've now begun to understand through science is that even plants have a profound networked intelligence. They have like more of a distributed intelligence, and they have up to 20 different senses, way more than we have, in the ways that they actually relate to and feel into their environment. Plants have been shown to act intentionally and purposefully. They learn. They have memories. They communicate with each other, even through what biologist Suzanne Simard has called the wood wide web, where they connect with a mycorrhizal fungal network under the ground throughout an entire forest. And through that same mycorrhizal fungal network, they even have been shown to allocate resources as a community. And perhaps what's even more mind-blowing than this is cellular biologists who study what goes on inside individual cells now explain to us that even a tiny microscopic cell displays stunning intelligence, like this awe-inspiring intelligence within the cell. And so we can recognize that we have, each of us has roughly 40 trillion of our own cells within our body. And every one of those cells itself has thousands of sensors and proteins. It sends and receives hundreds of different signals at the same time. Each cell is aware of itself and others. It knows what to do. Cells have been shown now they cooperate in community. And a lot of the time they've been seen now to make decisions as a group. Now, all of these understandings have been kind of new insights developed from modern science. But other cultures have always had a much deeper sense of the same kind of intelligence within nature that in our more modern world we're just beginning to discover. And one culture in particular, if we look back, I want to focus on, comes from ancient China, and with the tradition of Taoism. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this great classic of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, which actually translates as the classic of Tao and De. And I'm sure also many of you have a sense of what Tao means, like when it's translated. Basically, it means something like the way or path. And it's the sense of like how the forces of nature manifest in the world. But you're probably less familiar with that word De. which is also there in the title, which refers to a sense of like spontaneity, the intrinsic nature that is inherent in all living things. And when the early Taoists looked at the natural world, they sensed that state of acting with De everywhere in nature around them. And they called that state of acting with its intrinsic nature as Wu Wei, or effortless action. And what they saw is that basically all non-human organisms seem to act in Wu Wei just naturally. But then the Taoists looked at that, and they looked at the difference between human beings, and they asked, what happened to human beings? Because it's only too clear that we don't always act in that sense of Wu Wei, or effortless action. And they posited this notion that actually we seem to act with what they called Yu Wei, which translates as more like purposive action. And they gave examples of Yu Wei as things like using a fire to dry up a well, or forcing water uphill to irrigate a mountainside. And of course, people at the time, and we might look at that and say, well, isn't that basically the fundamentals of civilization? Isn't that what civilization is all about? And the Taoists said, yes, exactly. And from that, they developed really what we might view as their own theory of civilization, which one of their great sages, Zhuangzi, described in his book in this way. He said, the men of old shared the placid tranquility that belonged to the whole world. That was the state of perfect unity. But then he said, people lived in common with birds and bees, and were on terms of equality with all creatures, like forming one family. But then, in his words, as civilization began to arise, people began everywhere to be suspicious that with this new Yu Wei purpose of action, with extravagant orchestras and gesticulating ceremonies, in his words, men began to be separated from one another. And what is fascinating is that when modern cognitive neuroscience looks at the evolution of the human species, they essentially corroborate that Taoist theory of civilization. What they see is, and what we now understand, is that in humans, the prefrontal cortex, that frontal part of our brain, is far more highly developed than in other mammals. And that's what mediates what the Taoists called our Yu Wei cognition. In modern terms, we call that things like symbolic thought, conceptualizing, planning, or creating abstractions. And now cognitive anthropologists, when they go back to look at the rise of modern Homo sapiens, they see that it was that emergence of symbolic thought that led to things like language, culture, art, and tool making, basically all the aspects of modern civilization. So we can now recognize that as human beings, we have a dual human consciousness. We have that conceptual consciousness that Descartes thought was our only identity, which we can recognize as being analytic, slow, rational, effortful, that the Taoists called Yu Wei. And we also have what we might call an animate consciousness that's intuitive, fast, emotional, effortless, a consciousness that we share with all basically living creatures around us on the earth. And that's the source of what the Taoists called Wu Wei, that effortless action. So from that, we can get to recognize that really our human challenge is not to just maximize for that one cogito ergo sum, that conceptual consciousness, but to integrate both of these systems in harmony. So now when we look at this question, who am I? From a deeper understanding, we can start to answer that question more like this, like I am a mind-body organism capable of integration. So let's now turn to this next existential question. Where am I? And again, if we look to the mainstream answer to that, and ask basically a random person in the street to start to answer that kind of question, well, they'll give some kind of answer, most likely of some sense of a split universe, some sense that we've inherited of a sort of transcendent God in some dimension, and the material world below that is fundamentally split from that kind of transcendent God. And in more modern terms, we see this split described oftentimes in terms of religion and science existing in different domains according to mainstream thoughts of that split. And it's that split that leads in many ways to our unsustainable worldview, where for millions of people around the world, it's considered okay to pray to that source of transcendent meaning, even while we ransack nature below, because of this split universe. But again, if we look to other cultures, we find that they never had that sense of that fundamental split in the universe. And if we turn again to traditional China, only this time to about 1,000 years ago, so more than 1,000 years after the rise of Taoism itself, we discover a very fascinating school of thought called the School of the Tao in Song Dynasty, China. This was about 1,000 years ago, about 1000 AD. And in that period, in the Song Dynasty in China, a group of sages and philosophers basically integrated three great sources of thought in China. One was Taoism that we just looked at. Another was Confucianism that also arose from more than 1,000 years earlier. And the third was Buddhism that entered China and actually, in fact, from India. And in that time, they integrated each of these three sources into a way of understanding the universe itself, that even though they call themselves a school of the Tao, we know it nowadays by the term Neo-Confucianism. And for the Neo-Confucians, the entire universe basically consists of qi, which they would consider to be matter and energy, and li, which they saw as the principles by which the qi is connected. And when they looked at the totality of all the li in the universe, they understood that as the Tao. Now I'm going to pause for a moment and just take you through a brief little video. Gives you a little bit more of a sense of that connectivity of the universe that they saw as the li. And you'll see why in just a moment.
The study of patterns in nature is not something that is very familiar in the West. But in ancient China, this science was known as Li. Li reflects the dynamic order and pattern in nature. But it is not pattern thought of as something static, frozen, or unchanging, like a mosaic. It is dynamic pattern as embodied in all living things. The arteries of leaves, the markings of the tortoise and the vein patterns on rocks are all expressions of nature's secret language in art. The labyrinth is one of many Li patterns. It is found in coral structures, mushrooms like the morel, cabbages, and in the human brain. The cellular pattern is another common form in nature. There are a myriad of different cellular structures, but all have a similar orderliness defined by their purpose and function. It is easy to be mesmerized with a constant play of forms. But what is most interesting is that certain archetypal forms seem to be woven into the fabric of nature at all. The branching pattern is another Li pattern, or archetypal pattern, that is observable at all levels and all fractal scales. Take, for example, this incredible image of a supercomputer simulation known as the Millennium Run, showing the distribution of dark matter in the local universe. It was created by the Max Planck Society in Germany. Dark matter is essentially what we previously thought of as empty space. It is like an invisible nervous system that runs throughout the universe. The universe is literally like a giant brain. It is constantly thinking, using a type of dark or hidden energy that science is only starting to understand. Through this immense network, unfathomable energy moves, providing the momentum for the expansion and growth of the universe.
Truly amazing, huh? Well, what we see from that, and I think that little video really gets us deep into an understanding of that, is how that initial insight from the Neo-Confucians from 1,000 years ago is so consistent with what basically modern system sciences are beginning to explore from the perspective of modern science, that recognition of our connected universe. And, we're familiar with system science in different disciplines. It might be systems biology or complexity science or chaos theory. And when chaos theory was first developed by Edward Lorenz back in the 1960s and 70s, he asked this profound question, looking at the way everything is connected in nonlinear ways, by saying, is it possible that the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil could lead to basically a tornado in Texas? And of course, he's not saying it would lead to, but that notion of that deeply interconnected nonlinear universe leads to these possibilities. And we can think of system sciences in general as recognizing that the interactions between things tell us more about them in many ways than the things themselves. Whether we're looking at things like starlings flocking in the sky, or schools of fish in the ocean, or the ripples of sand dunes, or the weather system of the earth, or even and just as we were looking at in that video, the actual the organization of galaxies, even in space, it's oftentimes the connection that is more important. And there's a great exercise I'd like to just take you through for a moment to get a sense of that, because it's very far from what our modern worldview tells us in terms of the importance of connections. I'm going to ask you, and this is a picture of myself when I was a little child. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a moment and think of yourself when you were a little child. Think of a photograph that you have of yourself as a little kid. And when I look at that picture of me as a little child, I know that's me. I even have sort of some of the memories to prove it. But the thing is, when I look at that little boy, I know that there's not a single molecule, most likely, in that little boy that is in me now today. Almost all of the cells in that little boy are no longer in me. They're different cells, but some cells stay in our bodies all through our lives. But even those are continually changing what they're actually made out of. So that's why I can be virtually certain that every part of me, like the chi, the stuff of that little boy, is totally different from what's in me now. So what connects me to that little boy? It's the li. It's the relationship between all the molecules in cells, between the different cells within the whole organism. That is what is actually far more important in terms of connecting me with the little boy than the actual stuff I'm made of right now. So when system sciences look at these patterns in nature, one of the most crucial that they look at, that was touched on in that video, are what they call fractals, like patterns that repeat themselves at different scales. And fractals indicate self-organized activity. And as a result, we see them virtually everywhere in the natural world. in things like coastlines, leaves, lightning, lungs, neurons. And when earth scientists look at nature as a whole, they've begun to see nature itself as basically a fractally connected system, where every cell basically is organized according to the same kinds of principles as its organism of which it's part, which is fractally connected with its species, which is then fractally connected with the ecosystem of which it's part, which ultimately is fractally connected with the entire living earth, or with Gaia. And so as a result of these understandings, now when we look at this question, where am I? We get to begin to answer this in a very different way than that split universe. We can begin to recognize each of ourselves as being part of a fractally connected, self-organized universe, which then leads us to this next question we can ask: what am I? And if we were to go actually to those Neo-Confucian sages back 1,000 years ago, one of them leads a way to a really great way to begin to answer that question. His name was Chu Shi. And he said, if one wishes to know the reality of Tao, one must seek it in one's own nature. But if we take that fundamental idea and then again go to that person in the street today and ask them about what is human nature, what is our own nature? Well, the answer they're likely to give you on that topic is very likely to relate somewhat to the ideas that Richard Dawkins popularized so successfully some decades ago, this notion of the selfish gene. In his words, as he described it in that book, The Selfish Gene, we and all other animals are machines created by our genes in a highly competitive world. And a predominant quality as a result of this, he says, to be expected in a successful gene is ruthless selfishness. So from that, the way that people like Dawkins and now the sort of modern popular science kind of interpretation of what life is and what we are is based on this idea of the gene, which is seen as the fundamental unit of evolution that dictates everything about the organism and that's inherently selfish and competitive. But what we now know from modern findings in biology is every one of those three beliefs about the gene is actually false. The genes, we now understand, are actually part of an iterative process with the cell. Rather than dictating everything about the cell, they're part of a vibrant, dynamic, circular flow of interactivity. And scientists tell us now we should understand the genotype more like an artist's palette, like a repertoire of capabilities that the cell itself can select based on its particular needs as determined by the environment. And to give you a really powerful sense of this, consider for a moment the cute little solitary grasshopper sitting on a leaf, munching away like this gentle solitary creature. Well, it turns out that that grasshopper has exactly the same DNA as a massive herd of aggressive locusts that act collectively together and can swoop in and destroy like hundreds of square miles of land in just a few hours. And those two creatures are have the same DNA. In fact, what happens is the organism within that solitary creature actually expresses different parts of the DNA to turn into a locust at certain times. And then they'll go right back to actually changing their actual shape and even their brain to go back to grasshoppers again. So that gives you a sense of that. But then what about the notion of cooperativity? If we recognize that genes aren't the only aspect that dictates the cell. Well, if we look now at the evolution of complexity of life, when evolutionary biologists look all the way back billions of years ago, there's only been a few major shifts in the greater and greater complexity of life, from single cells to complex cells, to multicellular life, to simple animals, and then mammals, and then the ecosystems that we know and love today. And what we now know is that every one of those great steps in the complexity of life came about through increases in cooperation, not through increased competition, but cooperation. So life itself, we now understand, evolved through cooperation. In the words of systems biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And the great secret that life discovered through each of those evolutionary steps is known in biology as mutually beneficial symbiosis, which we can think of like a harmonic dance of life. And so if you walk into a forest right now, wherever you live, and just experience what's around you, what you're part of is this incredible dance, this harmonics of symbiosis, where plants photosynthesize and provide nourishment for the other animals, where insects pollinate those plants. Animals transport their seeds, as well as fertilizing the soil for the plants. The fungus regenerates the soil. And as we saw, those mycorrhizal networks transport nutrients for the trees elsewhere in the forest. And every element of this is this incredibly complex dance of symbiosis. So we now can recognize that organisms are actually really self-organized, fractal, dynamic patterns. As systems biologist Cole Worser describes it, organisms need to be understood as resilient patterns in a turbulent flow. And as he says, we must come to see them, to understand living systems in any deep sense, not materialistically like machines, but as stable, complex, dynamic organization. And it's those dynamic organizations working together within an ecosystem that cause this fractal cascade of abundance that we get to enjoy in the richness of life today. So now when we ask ourselves this question, what am I? We can begin answering it in this way, like, I am a resilient pattern of self-organized cooperation, which leads naturally to this next question: how should I live? And again, if we begin with what our modern dominant culture answers, it'll tell us something like, well, humans are intrinsically selfish and greedy. So in fact, selfish behavior by individuals is in the best interest of everyone. That's the foundations of like the neoliberal ideology that's taken over our world. Best phrase probably at the beginning of that, the rise in neoliberalism, in that movie Wall Street that came out in the 1980s, where Gordon Gekko said, greed is good. And even those who don't necessarily agree with that moral precept that greed is good, and to his credit, Richard Dawkins is one of those, then argue that we have to overcome our selfish genes. In his words, he says, let's try to teach generosity and altruism because we're born selfish. So if we can understand what those selfish genes are up to, maybe we can upset their designs. But if we look to what modern psychology tells us, evolutionary psychologists who've looked at how humans evolved, what we now recognize is we evolved to be cooperative. Millions of years ago, our pre-human hominid ancestors, when they found themselves in more away from tropical forests and in more savanna environment, they were vulnerable to predators. And those who learned to collaborate were the most successful. And over millions of years, our human identity expanded from just ourself and our kin to include the entire group that we are part of. And that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is actually what differentiates us from other primates. So as a result of that, we humans evolved what are known as moral emotions. We feel deeply things like shame or compassion or guilt or gratitude or embarrassment. And with these emotions within us, it means that we don't just act morally because we think we should, but we do so because it feels right. And that is a deep recognition that indigenous cultures from around the world always understood. And they evolved their own patterns of morality based on that. We see, for example, in Africa, this core concept of Ubuntu, which basically means I am because you are. And here in North America, where I am, the Lakota tribe have this crucial concept called Mitakuye Oyesin, which basically means we are all related. And they're referring not just to their own direct relatives right there, but all living sentient beings around them. So from that, we begin to recognize that our flourishing is based on our intrinsic connectedness, connectedness within ourselves, with others, with the natural world, and with the living earth. And that human flourishing itself is fractal, that each of us is really like a human body, a human mind-body organism, which is like a fractal part of a community. And each community is a fractal part of the living earth. And from that, we can begin to develop an alternative life-based value system, which I think was really best summarized by the great humanitarian Nobel Prize-winning Albert Schweitzer in the 20th century, when he said, "I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live." And as a result, in his words, "I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality." And from that, as we look at that existential question, how should I live? We can take as a foundation what we hear from Albert Schweitzer, that I should live in reverence and care for all life, and all other elements really can arise from that. And so now let's turn to this final question. Why am I? And the answer that we get, again, coming from mainstream thought, basically even from the leading reductionist scientists, like Steven Weinberg was another Nobel Prize winner in physics, but a spokesperson for reductionism. And really, he said it more clearly than anyone can say it. He said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But if we begin to look at meaning itself as being a function of connectedness, we come to a very different answer. If we look at all these complex systems we've just been exploring in this session today, we see in them, as the number of connections increases, they lead to phase transitions, which leads to the emergence of new meaning. And if we look at our world around us, we see that to be true in virtually every aspect of our world. For example, we recognize that when words connect in complex ways, language emerges. When organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. When neurons connect in our brains, consciousness emerges. And many of you, I'm sure, have had some sort of peak experience of a sense of like an emergence of everything in the universe, like that sense of oneness that sometimes we might have, and it might sometimes inform our very deepest sense of what meaning is in our lives and in the universe. And at those times, what we can understand from this, from what I've been taking you through, is that recognition of oneness is not in any way separate from a scientific understanding of the universe. But in fact, what modern science points us to is that kind of peak experience of oneness is really the deepest insight that we can have into the nature of reality itself. And in those moments, we can get to recognize that we basically live in a vast fractal universe, a universe with patterns that are both recognizable and forever unfolding, one that is mysterious beyond human comprehension, and yet manifesting a deeply meaningful harmony that permits us, with reverence and with awe, to touch into its unfathomable glory. And to get a feeling for what that actually means, to kind of touch into those moments of that oneness that some of us may have been fortunate to have at some points in our lives, I'm going to take you through another brief video, which is basically a video of a kind of a zoom out from a fractal pattern. And this is a really amazing video to just kind of feel into the quality of what it transmits. But I'm also inviting you, as you do this, to think of yourself really within this fractal pattern of this universe. You can almost imagine either a single cell within you or yourself as an identity, starting from the very beginning of this video. And as it begins to unfold, just feel into the enormous, awesome way in which you are part of something so much bigger, which then itself is part of something so much bigger, seemingly in an infinite layer of unfolding. So now let me take you through this video. Wow. I never cease to be just totally awed every time I watch that video. It's just that sense of how as soon as you feel you've framed where you are, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, just as a fractal universe actually is. And that incredible sense of being connected deeply within this fractal universe has implications. And the implications are that everything you do in your life creates Li ripples, which affect everything else in the universe. So it's like this core principle of the ultimate connectivity of everything in the universe. We recognize that basically we exist in an ocean of Li, and the Li ripples within each of us. They exist within each of us. And as a result of that, the choices we make, the personal choices and actions, choices maybe to participate in regenerative communities, choices to engage even in the broader political process, every one of those choices we make are ultimately what weave the web of meaning. And so when we ask this final question, why am I? We can begin to answer that question, each of us in our own way, by starting from that point of, I am here to weave my part in the web of meaning. And perhaps if enough of us can do that and do it together in ways that actually have an impact, perhaps we might just be able to regenerate our beautiful, fragile earth that is under so much attack from our dominant mainstream civilization right now. So just to let you know, if any of you are interested in like delving further into what I've been taking you through today, a lot of these ideas go deeper in this book, The Web of Meaning. These are websites that you can connect with me on. And maybe later in the next hour, we can talk a little bit more about this new network of deep transformation that I invite you to explore and to join at deeptransformation.network. But for right now, what I'd like to do is pause for a moment and begin to plan to go into breakout groups for 10 minutes and no more than that, groups of up to 4 people. And in that, when you're in your breakout room, the question I invite you to ask of yourself and then share your exploration with others in the group is, what is the unique and sacred strand that you are weaving in the web of meaning? And let's give ourselves 10 minutes to do that. And one thing I just wanted to give you a heads up is you might see me joining your group for just a brief time, because I love to just kind of hover like a sort of fly on the wall, just to kind of feel into what the conversations are that are taking place. No need to interact with me or any way. I just consider me more like that sort of fly on the wall, and then I'll just disappear again at some point. And after the breakout groups, if you don't want to join a breakout group, of course, the invitation is to just be on pause and come back to the main room later on. And let's engage in a conversation about these questions. Share what arises in your group, or ask any questions that you have that might have arisen from this presentation. So at this point, I would invite anybody who wants to either ask a question of me, or share any insights that came up in their groups, to do so. And if possible, if you're comfortable, please raise your Zoom hand, and we'll call on you and ask the question so we can hear all the different voices in the room. If you prefer to ask the question but stay more kind of quiet, then please just do so in the chat, so that we can we can also make sure you're heard there, so I can answer. So let's just pause for a moment and see who wants to be the first to bring questions into the space. And there were a couple of questions I saw arising in some of these breakout rooms, where I said, please ask it in the big group so that everyone can get a chance to hear. So I invite people who did ask me those directly to do so. And it looked like Mike, you just raised your hand. I wasn't sure if that was intended or that was the question.
Yes, Jeremy, I'm wondering how you see Li in relation to the traditions, the Eastern traditions that you mentioned, Taoism, Buddhism, and so on, whether that is almost synonymous with what from a Buddhist point of view would be called emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there are some interpretations of the Buddhist notion of emptiness which don't quite correlate with that, and there are some interpretations that do. And what is actually quite fascinating is that I was taking you through the Neo-Confucian sages who came up with this concept of Li as fundamental to their understanding of the cosmos, and a lot of what they were doing, interestingly enough, was reacting to Buddhism in China that had become very significant, sort of almost like mainstream. But they were trying to actually get back to what they saw as as a more sort of Confucian understanding of the universe. And there was some great quotations from that time where they were blisteringly attacking the Buddhist idea of emptiness. And they'd say, you walk into this monasteries and you hear everyone basically chanting emptiness, emptiness, all is emptiness. And they say, there's no emptiness at all. Everything is filled with connectivity. And, you look at the mountains and thankfully the universe will never be empty the way the Buddhism. So there was this kind of deep misunderstanding, really, I feel, taking place, because what was also and so what I find fascinating in this Neo-Confucian way of putting things together, they were basically trying to reject both Taoism and Buddhism to come up with a renewed sense of Confucianism. But because those ideas were so deeply embedded in 1,000 years of thinking, they ended up synthesizing all three, even when they weren't even intending to. And what is also fascinating is there's a school of Buddhism called Huayan Buddhism that some of you may be aware of. That has, if you've come across the idea of Indra's net, it's this profound image of all the different of this kind of God that created this net, which has had infinite amounts of jewels. Each jewel reflects all the other jewels in it. Just this, a lot like that fractal video I was taking you through of what the universe really feels like. That was a Buddhist tradition really giving to that sense of emptiness, but it was also a source of the idea of Li. They were some of the first people to come up with talking about Li 100 or more years before mainstream Neo-Confucianism took that idea and turned it into the Neo-Confucian. So I personally see that emptiness as exactly really a way of describing Li, the interconnectivity of the. So
and it's interesting, and I'm grateful for having the interpretation that Li is also an interpretation of dark matter, which makes it doubly interesting, and which raises the question, you know, what does non-duality mean in this context?
Right. Yes, I think that is a profound way of connecting those two things. Thank you for pointing that out, Mike. Yeah, great. And let's turn to Max. I think had just his hand up next.
Yes. Well, okay. I love that. Just recognizing, in a sense, we are coming around in a new way of finding the same thing. I'm particularly interested in, you mentioned Matakwiyas, the Lakota expression, you know, which often going into the lodge, or, you know, it's an expression that, if translated, is most often, you know, for all my relations, although it could be we are all related, but for all my relations, and that sense of getting that, so I think, and then the notion of dialogue came up, and you know, I've spent some time with David Bohm in 1980. Him and some of his contemporaries, they were all a little older than I was, and at the time I was spending a lot of my time with Native American people, many politically active and spiritually, you know, all of that. So, but there's another book by a contemporary MIT professor, David Isaacs, called Dialogue, that he described, because dialogue came up yesterday meaningfully, I think, in our conversation as well. And he talks about it as a conversation with a center rather than sides. But he talks about the word dialogue through the word, and that logos. And again, that was brought up in a very meaningful way, I think, you know, that our sense, a context of all things being related. And so he said, this was in the introduction to his book, he said, if you ask me, he brought up the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, which some Christians are very proprietary about exactly what that means, you know, but he said it means, I have to say, it means relationship. You know, that's where I started with the notion of the you and I verse, that we're all in, you know, but for me, that idea that there's something so different from the Western hemisphere cultures and Western culture, you know, the twain shall never meet, you know, the white man is never going to get it. And, you know, but I got that, no, these are the same deeper insights, you know, that we come around to again in another context, in a sense, you know, and so I think the same maybe with those differences that were just pointed out about China and India and stuff. And yes, they are different, but underneath that, in the implicate order, at least, you know, there is that commonality, and competition. The root of that is to strive together, you know. So and now I'll shut up, because I'm not asking you a question. And I
Yeah.
apologize for that.
No, and that's fine, because I really encourage this to be just a conversation. And if there's things I have to add, which in this case I do, that's great. But it doesn't have to be a question, because I don't claim to have all the answers. And so I feel like the answers really can mostly emerge in an emergent process of all of us sharing our perspectives and coming to these shared realizations together. But I just do want to add to your point, which I love, that connection with the indigenous set of values and understandings arising from connectivity, and something that's really been incredibly important to me that I think is profound, that there's a Comanche social activist. Her name is LaDonna Harris, and she's a scholar. Oh, you know her. And so she spent many years working with other indigenous groups from around the world to develop a sense of what they called collectively indigeneity. And we have to be kind of careful at some point, because you don't want to essentialize indigenous people as, oh, they've got all the answers, and they're all the same, and all those things are not appropriate, because of course every indigenous culture is unique, and yet there's something they share which really is almost like our shared human heritage from earliest times before agrarian civilizations went in different directions. And she wrote a great paper describing this, where she came up with what she called the 4 R's, which she refers to as relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution. And each of those, we can, I don't want to go too deep into it, but there's relationship is like the kinship obligation. Responsibility is like the community obligation. Reciprocity is like this cyclical obligation to balance what you give and take. And then redistribution is like recognizing that each person has a particular something of not just material wealth, but something special in skills, time, or energy. And their responsibility is to redistribute that to the group as a whole. So there's a beautiful ethical compass really coming around from that sense of connectivity. So now let me go to Niels, if I could first, and then let's go back into the order that of people put their hands up. But if you want to, oh, I'm sorry, is that?
Yes. Hello.
Hi there, Niels.
Hi. It was a very lovely presentation with lots of good things to talk into, and I think one of the problems I have with the fractals is that it shows things as it possibly looks like, and we can compare it with what we see in nature, and that's correct. But usually there's something deeper behind what we see, which I believe is mind, and some kinds of religions have an understanding of mind, especially Christianity. That's and so that's where I come from. So
interesting.
I'm really fascinated about the web of meaning. So it's all about meaning. Unless we can make meaning out of it, we can't understand it. So
yeah,
and in a sense, that is one of the problems we have, us left-brainers, as Ian McGilchrist calls them, that we can't actually think clearly, and that can be demonstrated by the same algorithm.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I really
that same algorithm can do miracles, basically, and basically kills the concept of complexity, because in its paradigm, complexity doesn't exist.
So yeah, to follow on from what you're saying, Niels, that idea of mind, I think actually if we take that idea from being like a human, like that sort of Cartesian, like I think therefore I am, so like mind being more human based, we can actually open that out to the notion of that animate intelligence that arises from self-organized behavior. And that's where I think if we expand the definition of mind to basically almost like conceive of the mind of the universe, but not from an anthropomorphic sense, saying like, well, we're humans have a mind, and so the universe has a mind like that, but rather to recognize that there is a deep self-organized intelligence, like I was saying in that presentation, like that we can't even begin to penetrate the mystery of it. But with our human collective minds, we can sort of touch into some of the patterns of that. I feel that's something that no matter which tradition one might come from, we can open up into that realization. So thank you for that. And I see a number of hands up there. So let me go back to Alan, who I think was next in line, and let's follow in our order now.
Jeremy, thank you for a tremendous presentation. I've got a couple of observations and a question. I mean, just one observation is I thought the great acceleration slide was said so much. And one thing I wondered was what percentage of resources in the last, say, 50 years are actually used to create new forms of entertainment and pleasure seeking, because that seems to be has been a huge growth area. The other observation is that I'm just struck that individuals, companies, governments always undertake initiatives and face challenges seeking specific objectives and goals. Everything is very linear. Now, related to those two observations, I really loved the phrase web of meaning. And I was wondering, what practical advice could you give us that would take us more into cultivating webs of meaning as opposed to, well, distracting ourselves through entertainment, or actually being very linear, seeking goals in our lives?
Yes, thank you for that, Alan. Well, let me say a couple of things to answer your question. First is I do think from a practical point of view, we need to recognize that our dominant culture is built a lot on consumerism. Basically, the fundamentals of capitalism is in many ways the economic manifestation of that worldview of separation to exploit and extract and maximize profits. And so much of what is all the brilliance of technology is being designed to do just what you say, to actually keep humans in general on what's known as the hedonic treadmill, to continue to have needs and be told that that's what you're meant to be doing, to then fulfill those needs by spending more money and putting your whole life's energy into essentially just sort of making more money for those mega corporations. So one thing is to get off that hedonic treadmill. And to do that, I think one of the most important things we can do is to allow ourselves to expand our identity that arises from that recognition of our deep interconnectedness. I talked a little bit in this session about this notion of fractal flourishing, recognizing that our flourishing itself is fractal. And what I mean by that is that it really starts off with recognizing that our identity itself is fractal, that I do have an identity as a separate human being, and pleasure can feel good to this particular identified organism, and things like status or security, all of those things, it's quite fine and reasonable. And actually part of flourishing for me to recognize those needs within me, and for each of us to recognize those needs. But at the same time, once our identity expands to include our group, which is a very natural human way to do it, and then expands to include a larger society, and then all of humanity, and ultimately all of life, once we can expand to that, it doesn't mean we have to take one of those fractal layers at the expense of the others, but we can let our identity itself be more fluid at each of those layers. And doing that, the very notion of flourishing itself becomes one of wanting to flourish at all those layers, which involves recognizing that the flourishing of one layer doesn't come at the expense of the others. It's not a zero-sum game, but actually we can pursue paths with our own lives to actually enhance the flourishing at all layers. So ultimately, to my mind, what that leads to is this recognition, just as Albert Schweitzer said in that quote I gave, that I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And from that, I mean, I have a question that I put on my wall right in front of me, right behind my computer here, which I look at every day, which basically says, what can I do for the greatest benefit of all life? And that's what an answer, a question I try to live into each day, and also for my path, my life path as it exists, to recognize that once we get to the sense, there's almost like this divinity we can see in life itself. And from that basis, we can ask ourselves, live into that question each day, what can I do for the greatest benefit of all life? That becomes a sacred question, as well as a practical question, as well as maybe even a political question. And those distinctions no longer necessarily have much validity. So yeah, thank you so much for asking that.
Truly wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So let's move to Philip.
Hello, Jeremy.
Hi there.
I also much appreciated your presentation. Yeah, I totally agree with you about our organism, the scale within scale within scale, and the resilient transience that flows through it. My background is medical and also artistic. I've worked with sculpture and flowing water with sculpture, fluidity with sculpture. Through both those, became interested in what I would call the morphodynamics or the kinemorphodynamics of the heart, the whole heart, but also within the heart, the valves, the muscle, particularly of the left ventricle, scale within scale within scale. Mm-hmm. There's one thing in your talk that I take issue with, which is the extent to which you use the fractal metaphor. We're not self-similar scale within scale within scale. It's true that the, say, branching blood vessels, like the branches of a tree, have a few repetitions of fractal repetitions, but only a few, maybe 4, 5, 6. And then you go to something different in the microvessels. And then in the cells around the microvessels, you go to something different. So I'd say that the morphodynamics or the kinemorphodynamics is different at every scale within a living organism, and yet compatible with one another. So, for example, within a heart muscle cell, you have actin and myosin filaments and little cross-bridge cycles, which are kind of running along each other within these protein filaments. The whole muscle cell is like a sausage that contracts one way and fattens laterally, but it fitted into a muscle of the left ventricle, which contracts in all directions globally, but fattens mainly through the wall thickening. How does it do that? Through the most exquisite kinemorphodynamic microstructure within the heart muscle. That's enough said about the multiscale morphodynamics, but I do want to just come back to meaning, the question of meaning. And for me, I utterly experienced through medical school, which and as a junior doctor, this deprivation of meaning through analysis,
Right.
through analysis and attempted comprehension. The more you kind of try to understand, the less and less it means. So what? Yes. And I got out of medicine for 9 or 10 years before going back, as it happens, into working with a heart surgeon on the morphodynamics of flow through the heart, because I'd studied sculpture and flow. Yeah. But this question of meaning, for me, on that 10-year gap decade, I discovered the Goethean approach to science. Goethe and Schlegel and Alexander von Humboldt really practiced an observational-based science where you withhold your previous interpretations and allow nature to speak for herself. And if you apply that to the human organism, compared with our most sort of nearest mammalian cousins, obviously we're different. An elephant's different from a lion, and we're different from a chimpanzee, and we're different from a gorilla. How are we different? We're different in our poise and uprightness and the withholding of our maturity to go through a long childhood and schooling, and in the coming of freedom, selfhood, self-determination. And we're all unique in that. So I'm kind of going along with it, saying, yes, we all have a part to play. But this selfhood is a dangerous thing as well. It can turned into selfishness. But this self-determination is so important. So in reading a meaning into what you've spoken about, there's one kind of meaning in fractals. You recognize so much of it in nature, but as an algorithm, as it were, the Mandelbrot set it doesn't have meaning beyond that. It's kind of can stand for something else. So what's our meaning? I think our meaning as human beings is freedom to either do things badly or try and find our direction. So I'm both agreeing with you, but slightly disagreeing.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And yeah, you raised some really good points, Philip, and thanks. And let me touch on that first point you said first on your perception that fractals only apply to a certain place, and then of course you have big differentiation, and you described that so well. But actually at a deeper layer, and this is what I find so fascinating, there's certain biologists who've tried to study what are the principles of life itself, and they've actually identified a number of principles of life itself that apply to a single cell as much as they apply to an organism, as much as they apply to an ecosystem, as much as they apply. And when you come up to the level of Gaia itself as an Earth system, there are some things that may or may not apply. So it's more a little bit of a question. But there are certain principles there that are fractal, in the sense of there are things like principle like integration, of which I define as basically unity with differentiation, which you'll see within each of those layers of scale. And there's other actual principles of life itself, things like conservatism, that when life discovers something that works, it will maintain that in its DNA structure, which will then be passed on from one generation to the next. And along with that comes the old, like an opposite element of that, which is a sense of flexibility, where it's able to then separate out certain aspects within any particular entity while maintaining that unity. And there's about 5 or 6 different elements around that. And those are, and I didn't get to that level of detail in that presentation because obviously it's too much to cover, but those are the principles that do apply fractally at every layer, including us as humans. But to your point, though, what is key, and again, this is something I didn't cover in this presentation, but in the book, The Web of Meaning, I come to it again and again and again, is that sense of integration. Because actually, I see that as fundamental to what we actually need to do as a civilization to move away from that destruction, is to find ourselves integrating with the rest of life. And so in a way, to come to your second point there, I see, I see the word meaning itself really as being a function of connectivity, just like I described in that session. But when we ask what is the purpose, if you will, as taking the word purpose separate from meaning of us as human beings, where is our sort of teleology in relation to the rest of life? In my mind, it is to find a way to truly integrate that unique conceptual consciousness that we have, which is different from other animals, with our animate intelligence and with the animate intelligence of all of life, and find a true integrated way of moving forward, which really a different foundation for our civilization, rather than one of extraction. Oftentimes others, and I really love this term, would call it an ecological civilization. If we can move towards that way of relating to the earth, which has also been called the symbiocene, which I love, like this notion of moving from the Anthropocene to symbiocene, that could be our what our true purpose as human beings could really be to fulfill that ability as part of life. So not giving up what is very special and unique about us as humans, but to integrate it with the rest of life. So let's turn to Anne. And Anne, you want to share your question or perspective?
Yes, it's not really so much a question as a comment. First of all, I think your presentation was wonderful. And I wish you would do a series of television programs like Sir David Attenborough, that you could teach humanity what you have learned, because it's so important. And what humanity is suffering, particularly in the West, is, as you so rightly said, is meaninglessness. And because there's no meaning in people's lives, they fill it with consumerism. And they also become more and more dependent on government to help them out of every difficulty. I was just watching a talk by someone whose name I can't remember about this very fact. So the more they're dependent on government, the more government doesn't know what to do and is flapping around and is devoid of any ideas at all, because it hasn't got the root of what you say of relationship and connection. And I was just thinking, you as a little boy of 5, presumably in that picture, if the little 5-year-olds could be shown what you've shown us in a manner that they could understand, what a huge difference that would make to their whole adult, becoming an adult, because they would have the foundation correct. Whereas now we have no foundation and things are in a terrible mess, getting worse. So I would just like to thank you and to say, I wish you could do more for education of small children and get into schools. And on television, can you break through that wall, preventing people like you from communicating with the world, really? Anyway, that's enough for me, but thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for those kind words, Anne. And I think you're raising some really great points. One, it has to do with education. It's really, we absolutely have to fundamentally change our form of education, which right now is more increasingly focused on not really at all trying to educate children to fulfill their lives, but actually to educate them to become sort of cogs in this machine of consumerism, and to actually educate them to learn to become good consumers, to learn to become producers within the machine so they can ultimately be part of it, which is consuming the earth. And so, I mean, there's this great distinction that Aristotle made between hedonia and eudaimonia. Eudaimonia being really learning how to fulfill your true purpose in life, whatever you are, as a human being or an animal, whatever it might be. And if education really should be shifted towards teaching children how to pursue that long-term well-being, how to pursue their eudaimonia. And it goes even deeper than education, goes even to the earliest months and years of an infant's just becoming part of the world, is right now patriarchy, from millennia of patriarchal institutions, it instantly from infancy onwards teaches notions of obedience, and you'll be punished if you're not obedient, and you've got to learn to push those feelings and emotions down if they don't fit, and all those things. And those are some of the fundamental changes we need, because those are some of the ways in which those very repression, those sort of acts of repression early on in infancy end up leading to things like fascistic thinking and all the kind of the destructive ways that we see being played out in politics around the world. So thank you so much for sharing that, Anne. And I do see a great thing mentioned in the chat about the book called The Nordic Secret, which I do recommend strongly, which is this wonderful exploration of how in the Nordic countries, they use this notion of bildung, which is this notion of kind of continued education through life, but educating people to really fulfill who they are, not just as individuals, but as part of their communities, to learn to be really responsible members of contributing to community, which has led so much to the relative success of Nordic countries. So let's turn to Bernard now.
Jeremy, thank you so much, first of all, for your wonderful selection of slides, and of course the words on them. And I have to confess that I'm not sure if I should, but I always take screenshots of interesting slides, and I couldn't keep up. You had so many beautiful slides. But I agree entirely with what Anne said. It would be the basis of a wonderful TV series, rather like David Attenborough's programs, as I think Anne mentioned. And indeed, in some sense, the theme is rather overlapping with some of David Attenborough's programs. But really, the comment I wanted to make was more to do with the question you posed us, the breakout groups. I found that a very challenging question, because there were so many interesting words in your thing, you know, unique, sacred, strand, meaning, web, and really each of those words is, you know, would warrant an hour's discussion in itself. But I mean, I suppose the word which actually I found most challenging was unique. And so I thought I'd just ask you about that. I say that because although, of course, all of us in our group, we could give our purpose, if you like, our meaning of our particular strand. But the problem was that one realized that actually it's not really unique. So I have a purpose, which I won't, you know, say what it is explicitly, but I have a purpose. But I realized that actually there are many other people, maybe 100 other people have the same purpose. And also one realizes that your one individual purpose is very often just part of the purpose of a larger organization.
Right. Yes, I hear what
and so and precisely, and that was in a sense the point of your talk, in some sense. We're all part of this hierarchy of structure. So when you say, how am I unique? It's hard to answer, because it's like there are billions of cells in the human body, and how are you unique? But that's why I found the question so interesting, because one's feeling might be that in some sense one isn't unique, because there's just so many other cells, so many other people on the planet. And yet in some sense it's rather like we're all strands in a tapestry. But we know that if any one of those strands breaks, you know, if you have a pullover, maybe let's make it a pullover, you know, if one of those threads breaks, you know, the whole pullover is going to fall apart. So there is a sense in which one is unique, hopefully, because we all like to think we've got in some sense a unique role. And and the only thought that I had was that it fascinates me, because I do research in my professional work. I'm a physicist, and what always fascinates me is that there are 8 billion people on the planet, which makes one feel very insignificant, and yet we know that someone doing research will be having a unique thought. Right. Nobody else has ever had on the whole planet, or possibly even the whole universe. Exactly. Which to me is just an amazing thought. Yeah. And it may not be, we're not all going to have such a profound thought as inventing general relativity or quantum theory, but whatever the thought is, it's unique. Just like when we make up a poem or a piece of music, it's unique. And to me, I find that fascinating, because in some sense, the other word was sacred, because you didn't explicitly say much about sacred, but it seems to me the sacredness comes in precisely because one is unique. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much for pointing that out. And I think you have captured exactly what I'm talking about there. And it does come back to this key concept that I was relating to just a few minutes ago, of integration, that in every system, and as tiny as a cell or as big as Gaia, as large as the universe, what we are in integration, and there's a process that's known as reciprocal causality, where basically the system as a whole affects each part, and each part affects the system as a whole, and every part is unique, but also part of something bigger. So that sense of unique is absolutely true. Every one of us, every thought, like you say, that happens in each one of us, 8 billion minds all the time, is absolutely unique and is also part of something bigger. And the sacredness, I would posit, is actually that connectivity between our uniqueness and the vastness of the universe. That's what makes it sacred, because we are all part of this incredible divinity of the universe out there. So really appreciate you bringing that into the conversation. I'm also noticing, we have just about 10 minutes to go, and we have 4 more hands up.
And so let's try to make sure that all 4 of those hands up get a chance to share. So if we can keep each comment or question now for just 1 or 2 minutes at most, it'll give us a chance to have a Q&A with each person. So Peter.
Unmute.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm sorry, I've got to.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, great. It's about novelty, newness, and creativity. I'm a painter, and so every time I start a painting, it's new.
Right.
And so, whilst I appreciate the aspect of the indigenous and so on, and you know, going back into the wealth of our species, nevertheless, we're at the point. We're the ones at the point, and this new organism, this human, and the possibility of a new painting, and I think because with painting, we start so it's really joining a creative energy, if you like, but the possibility of it must be present.
Yes.
For the creativity to work through, which is quite separate in a sense to the person of me.
Right. Yeah.
And being as we've become such a destructive force on Earth, and yet we're at a point of change, if you like, newness. So we're all beginning again.
Yes.
We're all beginning a new portrait, if you like. Could you say what because it's more of a feely question, you feel the meaning of future human to be?
Yes, well, I think, and thank you for that. I love the way you're expressing that. And that is where I get very, very excited. In fact, I'm writing my next book on this topic of this vision of an ecological civilization. This is the possibility for future humans. And sometimes people will look at the idea of an ecological civilization is it's shifting the very foundation of our civilization from one that's exploiting and extractive to one that's life affirming, to try to set the conditions for flourishing for all beings, all people, along with all non-human beings on the earth. And then people sometimes respond to that saying, it's impossible. Like civilization itself is about destructiveness and exploitation, just like that Yu-Wei idea in Taoism. And this comes to your point. This is an opportunity. We have both the need, the requirement, and the opportunity to try to create something that is actually new, that has not yet been done in the human interaction with the earth. But it's our only real path to actually find a future of flourishing, is to do that. And so personally, I'm very embedded in trying to offer that as a possibility for what we can do into the future. But let me turn now to Kathleen. And hey, Kathleen.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for that presentation. It was wonderful. So I was struck by your comment around the integration piece. So from the context from which I live, life is always integrating. So one might say we're flourishing at all layers. When we're flourishing, we're integrating tensions, like our polarities that make us human, right? So from that perspective, self, other, and world are an integration. There is no separation. Ultimately, it's just individual expression in a collective focus, if you will. And so would you comment on that? Because to me, they're not separate at all. Other is you. So, I refer to it as you for you, you with other, you and world. Like it's all us.
Yes. And I do feel that is ultimately this realization of that way in which we are part of something so much bigger. But I feel it's very important to also recognize all the different layers of that, what I was talking before in terms of the fractal layers of identity. And in just the same way, like a single cell in my body. We've got those 40 trillion, and it really is part of me, right? But it's also its unique being, and it has its own membrane. And that single cell is continually saying, this molecule is what I need. I'm going to bring this into the membrane. This I don't need anymore. I'm going to expel that. This could be not good for me. I'm going to keep that out. And so we have to both embrace that each of us as human, basically mind-body organisms, have a membrane. And what is a healthy membrane is one that is semi-permeable, that allows in what is benevolent, that expels what is not, and that is also part in collective behavior of creating health for not just for ourselves, but that the very part of what we're part of is part of that health itself. And so I do feel that way of really fluidly moving from self, recognizing there is no other, but there is another too at the same time. It's essentially like a paradox. And we are all part of the universe and separate. Holding that kind of complexity is part of what can lead to that true integration. So thanks for that. Thanks for that. Right. Let me turn to Ray and Zoe. And I think we might just have time for those two final questions that people heard their hands up. So Ray. And you're on mute, I think, still, Ray.
Oh, there we are.
Yeah,
I'm a bit of an interloper, really, because I call myself an artist. I was actually trained as an engineer in my life. But I want to hand something out to Anne Baring, because she rather saved my life at the time of lockdown. I was boiling over with frustration at the stasis and the being controlled in the way that we were. And I wrote, well, in fact, I was looking at the the organization of all the scientists. I was looking for some new science, some people that could light me up or say something of value that is not tainted by the past or some of the really retarded control that goes on in the science community. Anyway, I wrote a letter to Anne Baring, and she humaned me beautifully, I have to say, and touched very much into the subject that interests me, which was, where is the missing feminine, or where's it coming from? I bought a book and consumed that in no time at all. And I said to her, I wrote back again and said, but how
Ray, if I can drop you, and just seeing we just have a couple of minutes left, I want to make sure we have time for Zoe. So could you maybe just come to a question or something you wanted to share, and then we'll have to, sorry to cut you short. But...
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the thing was, Anna Baring's thoughts on the missing feminine and how we can think differently to the way we usually do, to me was everything. And I said, well, how do you get on with all the other scientists coming from a normal left brain world? She said, well, they never read my work. They're not interested.
Right.
And that I thought was just genius. You know, there's an answer that just we can come from another place. Doesn't always happen.
Really appreciate that, Ray. And I do think that we also want to recognize that we are all part of this 10,000 years of like patriarchal thinking, which kind of separates, which sort of says male-oriented thinking or even male bodies somehow should have more power than female. And I think moving towards more balance is absolutely crucial. But at the same time, it's important not to essentialize female as being, oh, they're what people who are more earth-based, males are more sort of head-based, but to recognize the gender itself is in many ways a construction of the patriarchy, and that we can all, like whatever kind of bodies we have, we can all be open to that places, sort of like a yin and yang, the yin and yang of our existence in a way that can be so much healthier. So thanks for that, Ray. And
all your presentations are beautiful, I have to say.
Yeah, thank you
really for this. Say hello to Anne Baring for me.
Well, and we just have a couple of minutes. So Max, I'm afraid we might have to miss your question, but can we close with Zoe's question or comments? And if you want to come off mute, Zoe. You're still on mute, Zoe. but your hand is up. It's possible, because we're not seeing your visual, Zoe, you might not be aware of us. And so let's actually then close with Max, because maybe there's we don't have Zoe's presence right now. So why don't we turn to Max for our final question?
Oh, I thought I was taking my hand down. I must have.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I
Sure.
apologize for that. It was a wonderful presentation, and then wrapping up this, the whole thing has been a great, wonderful experience.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Max, for that. And I do see that the time is, we've had our 2 hours, and I don't want to overrun people's time here. So thank you so much for that. I feel personally I learned a lot from our interactions today. And as I said, it's really, but that part of that recognition of connectedness is recognizing that our collective intelligence is so much greater than what any one of us has, which is why this kind of sharing, this kind of way in which we can share our perspectives, is the way that we as a human superorganism ultimately can gain greater in wisdom. So thank you to the Pari Institute for putting this on, and to all of you for taking part today.
Thank you, Jeremy, so much for that really moving, beautiful presentation. And thank you all for your participation in this Recovering the Sacred series. And really special thanks to John Pickering. John, thank you for putting this together. It's been so moving and beautiful. And just to invite you all to note that the Future Human series will be starting in January, taking over from the Future Scientist series that we've been doing all year. So I hope to see you there.